Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our latest in a series of Business Gateway panel webinars that we've been running. My name is Hugh Lightbody. I'm going to cover a few of the kind of housekeeping issues just up front as we give people the chance to get registered and into the system. So, kind of key thing, obviously, first is that everybody is on mute to avoid any background noise. We are recording the session so we can make it available afterwards to folks who maybe wanted to participate but weren't able to. I would encourage you to submit questions via the portal and we will try and address as many of those as we can. If there's anything that we can't pick up or don't cover during the discussion that you're interested in, we will follow up on those and we'll come back to you on that. So today our topic is budgets and specifically the UK government and Scottish budget. Two, perhaps, of the most significant political events of the year, which set the tone for the nation's economic priorities and for policy direction. What we hope to achieve in this webinar is to unpack some of the key announcements from those UK and Scottish budgets and explore their implications for small and medium-sized enterprises across Scotland. I'm joined today with an expert panel who will break down those fiscal measures, funding allocations, the policy updates that could shape the business environment in 2025 and beyond. So whether you're navigating those tax changes, seeking growth opportunities, planning for potential changes, hopefully this session can give you some practical insights and maybe some actionable advice tailored to you. So let's see where we get to. And as I say, I encourage you to put questions into the chat. We'll try and get to those. First up, though, what I'd like to do is get the panel to introduce themselves, their organisation, and a wee bit about what they do. So, Stacey, I'm going to come to you first.
Thanks very much, Hugh. Hi, everyone. My name is Stacey Dingwall. I am the Head of Policy and External Affairs at the Federation of Small Businesses in Scotland. So my team's role really is to influence some of these decisions that are taken at fiscal events like the UK and Scottish budgets.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stacey. Susan.
Thanks, Hugh. Hello, everybody. My name is Susan Love. So I lead the work of ACCA in Scotland. That stands for the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants. So I do a similar sort of job to Stacey in terms of taking the views and feedback from professional accountants and sharing that with decision makers. So our members will work in all kinds of finance roles across Scotland. They might be your local chartered accountant, but they might also be finance directors in larger SMEs, for example. So a range of sort of different views of feedback from finance professionals.
Brilliant. Thank you, Susan. And last but not least, Greg.
Hi, everybody. I'm Greg Sutherland. I'm a tax director at Johnston Carmichael based in Glasgow. Johnston Carmichael are the largest independent chartered accountants in Scotland. I work in the OMB tax team. I'm a tax director there. We advise businesses on effectively the life cycle from incorporation through to the end, through to, and my speciality is in restructuring. If the changes of the budget has brought about quite a shift in terms of things like inheritance tax. So if you're looking at things like succession planning, etc., then we're more than happy to have a conversation going forwards.
Brilliant. Thanks, Greg. I have to confess, as the years go on, I get more and more hard of hearing. I may have misheard you there. Did you say that you were part of the OMG tax team?
OMG.
As in, oh my God.
Yes. Maybe rebrand it as that, sorry. Owner managed business tax.
Brilliant. Just thought we might want to clarify that one. That's excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah. Apologies for my hard of hearing. Right, let's get into some questions and kind of begin to unpick and unpack what we've been hearing. I suppose just in terms of kind of an overview, in the first instance, I saw described on, I think, BBC News the other day, the suggestion that what Scotland had achieved was a wily budget. And I thought about that for a wee bit, and I thought, well, what the heck did that mean? And when I explored it a wee bit more, they were talking about this approach where basically they're taking Scotland's taking the extra money that they're getting from the UK and kind of saying, we're going to do something slightly different or a variety of different things. So whether or not that will translate into SMEs or businesses, don't know. But let's get into our questions. So first kind of thing I wanted to explore, and I'm going to come to Stacey first on this one. What are the headline announcements in this year's UK and Scottish budgets that SMEs should be particularly aware of?
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. I'll start with the UK budget, I guess, since that one came first. So the main things from a small business, from FSB's perspective, that were in that UK budget, we had worked really hard to push the Chancellor to increase the employment allowance for small businesses, which thankfully she listened to and more than doubled it from 5,000 to 10,500. Obviously, the main headline that we saw coming from the UK budget was that increase in national insurance contributions from employers. So the effect of doubling this employment allowance means that the smallest employers really, so we think probably about 4 or 5 employers and fewer, they will be shielded from that increase in the national insurance contributions. So it's really good that the smallest employers are being sheltered from, you know, what was a tough budget. So it was a bit of a pro-jobs prioritisation there for the smallest employers. Something else that we supported was the decision to retain the business asset disposal relief. So when you're if you're selling up your business, so they've decided to retain that up to £1 million, which is good. The level of relief will gradually reduce over time, but we're pleased to see a differential has been kept at this stage. Something that I think our members have welcomed is that freeze and fuel duty. That's kind of come as a huge relief for many. You know, obviously we think about 3/4 of Scottish small businesses rely on their vehicles for day-to-day operations, so any increase in that would have squeezed already thin margins for those small businesses. So I touched on though the national insurance issue, which I think we're all very aware of. We've been very clear in our warning that the difficulty this is going to place on those kind of larger SMEs in terms of meeting all those changes. Obviously, the UK government has signalled their plans on reforming employment law. There's the increase there in the national minimum wage, so that's a lot of costs that SMEs are going to have to absorb. Moving on to Scotland, the UK budget, the Chancellor announced that they would be extending business rates relief again to retail, hospitality and leisure businesses in England of 40%. Unfortunately, we've not seen that in Scotland since July 2022. That was the time that I joined FSB. I joined FSB and the rates relief went. I'm not claiming responsibility for that one or taking the blame for it. So it was good to see the Finance Secretary announce that that relief will actually be passed on to small Scottish hospitality businesses this year. Now, unfortunately, those in the retail and leisure sectors have been left out of that relief, which has been highly disappointing for our members in those sectors, to say the least. Talking about the increased consequentials, we know that the UK budget decision to pass on that relief resulted in 147 million in consequentials being passed on to the Scottish Government, and unfortunately what they've announced in terms of passing on to hospitality means that they're only passing on about 22 million of that extra money that they got, so it's a bit disappointing that they've not done a bit more there. Some other good things in the Scottish budget was the maintenance of both the small business bonus scheme, which is a real lifeline for our members, and also freezing of the basic property rate or poundage in relation to business rates is something that was good. We also saw an announcement about an investment in tackling retail crime through a new pilot initiative. That's a really big issue for Scottish retailers in terms of tackling that, so it's good that there's been an investment made there to start to tackle that organised element of it. But yeah, I think the biggest thing for us is just unfortunately retailers being left out of that decision with the rates relief, and we know unfortunately it will mean some difficult decisions for small businesses in those areas.
Brilliant, thank you, Stacey. Susan, any particular thoughts or other things you want to bring into that?
So I suppose if we are thinking about, I suppose we had a sort of similar reaction to both budgets, in fact, the Scottish and UK budgets, which was probably, well, it could have been worse based on previous years, which probably isn't quite the boost of confidence that we or business community were looking for. I think so much had been expected ahead of this UK budget. So with new election of a government in the summer and this long gap until the first budget, there had been a lot of speculation about how much change might arise. However, because of what's happened in budgets over the last couple of years, there's been a very strong message from the business community about not wanting surprises. So we simultaneously had an expectation of a lot of change, but not wanting a lot of surprise. And that probably resulted in the Chancellor and the media trailing almost everything in advance of the UK budget. So there weren't that many surprises on the day itself. And there was probably some positive signs around messages of stability. So, for example, commitments to corporate tax roadmap, setting out corporation tax rates that the UK government expects to keep in place, capital allowances remaining the same, so commitments around stability. And I think it would be fair to say that the Scottish Government had probably also heard that warning from the business community about how unhappy business community had been with previous budgets in Scotland, and looking for no surprises at a really difficult time. So a headline level sort of key announcement, Stacey's already mentioned, those grabbing most headlines were the employment cost change. So that's probably the most acute impact of UK budget related to, for example, the increases to national minimum wage, the changes to employer national insurance contributions that were mentioned, which will affect all those other than the smallest employers. There was also some headline grabbing measures around inheritance tax, which might come up later for farms, as well as there have been pre-budget behaviour around getting rid of shares because of changes to capital gains tax and such like. In Scotland, I would say the headlines weren't really focused on business policies per se, as you were sort of alluding to it at the start here. So more focused on other spending commitments and other policy areas for the Scottish budget. The most headline grabbing issues around Scottish budget tend to be around like income tax, where it's pretty much a steady as she goes on income tax bands and rates. There was a new tax strategy published by Scottish Government alongside the budget that gave a commitment to no more changes in tax bands for Scotland, so no new bands to be introduced for the remainder of this Parliament. However, that's only 18 months, so not particularly long-term commitment until there's elections in Scotland. And there were some increases to the thresholds for the start and basic rates of income tax in Scotland. So some marginal gains for the lowest earners, but the fiscal drag, so not increasing the thresholds in line with inflation, has remained in place for the other bands of Scottish income tax, and the same is true for UK rates of income tax. So it's worth checking if you're self-employed whether you're going to fall into a new band of income tax. Just a couple of other small things to mention. One detail that we've heard mentioned from our members in relation to Scottish budget is the additional dwelling supplement, the ADS, for the land and buildings transaction tax. So that is the Scottish equivalent of stamp duty, effectively the tax that you pay on property transactions. So that additional dwelling supplement has increased, I think, by 2%. Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, on second
Yeah, 68%, yes.
Yeah, so that possibly hadn't been foreseen. So that has some impact on property transactions, especially for landlords. And a couple of other things to mention. And we'll talk about this maybe a bit more, but there's a lot of information published in documents alongside the budget that you don't necessarily hear the Chancellor or the Finance Secretary talking about. And that's particularly important at the moment with a new UK government. So, for example, there's a new small business strategy was announced as part of the budget. So we don't know what will be in that. There'll be more detail to come. There has been a new fair payment code launched to tackle late payment issues. So that's launched by the Small Business Commissioner recently. And there has been funding announcements post-budget by UK and Scottish governments in relation to business startups, support for business startups, so for disabled entrepreneurs at UK level, for other groups in society less likely to start a business in Scotland, as well as in the margins of both budgets, additional funding commitments for both things like the British Business Bank, Scottish National Investment Bank, that provide funding for small businesses. So There's lots of detail to get into that perhaps wasn't entered in the headline speeches of either minister.
Okay, thanks, Susan. You've given me a thought as well for a potential future webinar in terms of something that explores the small business strategy in particular to kind of pick up on that, and a couple of other ideas in there, so thanks for that. Just kind of thinking then about the challenges that SMEs are facing, rising costs, access to finance, labour shortages, these kind of things. Do you think, based on what you've seen in these budgets, that they are addressing those challenges, or has nothing much changed, or are they addressing them, or have they made them worse? You know, hopefully not. Stacey, what's your thoughts on whether they're addressing the kind of challenges that your members or SMEs generally are facing?
Yeah, I think you touched on your skills and recruitment. Aside from the ever increasing costs, is really the biggest challenge that our members face. So, I mentioned that the smallest employers are being protected from the national insurance contributions through the employment allowance being doubled. But I guess what the concern would be, they're protected now, but will it put them off, hiring more employees, kind of looking to recruit? We're still waiting for more, some of the employment plans are out for consultation, the UK government just now. We know that the audit committee has actually come back and red rated some of the policies that they're putting forward. So it's still a bit uncertain just now as to how that's going to shake out, what will actually come through. So I guess at the moment, what we're hearing from our members is caution, to be honest, they're to see how that shakes out. So unfortunately, I don't think there was anything there that we've heard from our members. I think particularly in the UK budget, you talked about stability. I think what we would have liked to see was a bit more focus on growth and a bit more positive. I think the Chancellor said, it's the first budget the Labour government is going to be about stabilising. So it's going to be a tough one. So, I think we'd hope in the coming years that there'd be a bit more on growth and a bit more reason to be positive rather than, I think our members are having to be very cautious at the moment.
Okay. No, that's really helpful. I was saying to folks who are on the call, delegates on the call, to submit some questions if they have them, and we've got a few floating through, so thanks for those. I'm going to pick up one of those. We've talked there about national insurance and the changes that are happening. Somebody's asking, as a sole trader, do I have to pay national insurance contribution? And I guess questioning, is that mandatory or not? Now, does anyone want to pick that one up?
So that only affects people who have employees.
Yeah, the changes only affect the people who have employees, absolutely.
Yeah. However, I'm picking this question up that they are a sole trader. Do they have to pay national insurance? And my answer to that would be yes. You would have So,
I mean, they have to be. I mean, I don't know what their. If not operating through a limited company, they will have some form of national insurance to pay on their cooking profits. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, okay, what we're seeing and we're hearing and we're talking about to some extent is employer national insurance contributions have increased. So there's something around that. So if you're employing folk, yep, it's going to impact on you. But as a sole trader, you should be paying national insurance because that's, in the long term, that's your pension. So, yep, something you need to think about.
Class 2 and Class 4 national insurance contributions should be paid by a self-employed person.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully that was helpful. Here's an interesting question, Stacey. You are the Federation of Small Businesses. So somebody's asking, how do you define small? What's a small business? You just mentioned there about being exempted from national insurance. So what's a small business and where does the exemption kick in?
Yeah, for the majority, it kind of, it's between 0 up to 49 employees in Scotland. You can join FSB up to 249 employees, but the majority of members that we work with are, I think about 40% of our members are self-employed. I think in the main businesses that we work with are 10 or fewer employees, but you can join up to 249.
Yeah. An SME, small medium enterprise, you say is up to 249. A small is up to about 49. A micro is less than 10. I think is the kind of standard definition of those. And the exemption from national insurance, where was that kicking in, did you say?
So yeah, I think based on, as in the start, we think maybe around 4 or 5 employees, then you won't be affected because you've got the employment allowance. So up to 10.5. If your national insurance bill is up to 10.5 grand, you won't pay anything, but it's anything over 10.5 grand. If your national insurance bill, then that will kick in.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move on. Looking now at, we kind of touched on business rates, we've kind of touched on income tax. So are there any significant changes to business rates, income tax bands, or other financial policies that are going to directly impact on SMEs? Greg, I'm going to come to you on that one.
Not really. The changes in terms of national insurance and the changes in terms of national minimum wage in the UK budget are obviously going to impact on SMEs significantly. With regard to the Scottish budget, there was very little change with regard to the actual basic rate tax. That we reckon that for in terms of income tax, a Scottish taxpayer will only be saving around about £15 at the mid rates per annum, so it's very small. The budget was relatively straightforward from a tax perspective in that regards. Can I pick up on something you mentioned earlier on, just in terms of the first question? So the UK budget obviously has, we were very worried about the changes that were coming in terms of business asset disposal relief and capital gains tax. The good news was that there was some mood music that the capital gains tax was going to be aligned with income tax, which would be an absolute game changer. The fact that there's still 10% business asset disposal relief available up into on the first £1 million, 10% of the first £1 million business asset disposal relief up to the 5th of April next year is great in terms of planning for the future. Nobody will have failed to notice changes in inheritance tax. And inheritance tax, I mean, that's certainly been, Johnson Carmichael, certainly that's been the biggest questions that are coming our way around inheritance tax. Inheritance tax is going to, I don't think the changes certainly in business property relief were foreshadowed that much, unless I missed something in the press. I mean, we went from the position where the Conservatives were talking about potentially abolishing inheritance tax to a situation now where business property relief is not going to attract 100% relief that was there. So if you've got a business, certainly a small, for example, family business, we should be looking at succession planning and inheritance tax strategies. If there is a restructuring that's possible where somebody is potentially looking to leave the business, then the availability of the £1 million at 10% up into the 5th of April means that there's still things that can happen and still benefit from that rate. I don't know if the other people on the call agree, but I think 10% capital gains tax is possibly as low as it's ever going to be, certainly for the foreseeable future. So this is probably the last opportunity to potentially cash in on business asset disposal relief at 10%.
Any other thoughts on that?
Can I just mention another little policy that I think it's worth touching on that came up in the budget, and I think Greg's right in terms of there are clearly questions particularly for family businesses arising from this. It's definitely worth seeking advice on, but just one, without going back over business rates and income tax, just a couple of things I think it is worth mentioning that are specific policies which maybe direct but indirect impact on business owners. So the first is, whilst there wasn't change in Scotland, wasn't huge change on income tax, one change that people might notice in their pockets is a change in policy on council tax. So there's been money spent on maintaining council tax rate freezes in recent years, and that has now been removed. And so some councils have already started setting their budgets, and some are giving indicative 3-year council budgets, for example, which is relatively new. And some of the council tax increases that are being mooted are not great. And so for many business owners, particularly all those business owners that are based from the home or who don't have business premises, that is potentially another cost coming down the line to be aware of when your council sets its budget in the new year. One important thing to mention, which doesn't get a lot of press but was buried in the UK budget documents, is the next steps on making tax digital. Now, some people might be aware of this. Has been going on, rumbling on for, I don't know, 10 years or so now, this shift to move all of our tax reporting online. Now, it was supposed to happen this year, but has been delayed by 2 years. But introducing Making Tax Digital for income tax for self-assessment is going to be introduced from April 2026. That was committed to recently again by the UK government, and there's a little bits and pieces about further work for Making Tax Digital in the budget. So what's been committed to is that for those with income from self-employment over £50,000 per annum, this includes property income as well, you will have to move from if you do self-assessment at the moment, instead of one return a year that you do with your accountant, or perhaps you do it yourself online, you will move to a quarterly reporting regime with a final report. So you'll essentially move to 5 bits of input that are needed to the system. For some businesses, this will mean a fair amount of change that your accountant's going to require from you, and you can expect those demands to start coming in from next year, the preparation that your accountant will need to do and what they'll be asking of businesses as clients. That's going to kick in from next year, ahead of that April 2026 deadline. They also committed to reducing that 50,000 income from self-employment to 30,000, kicking in April 2027. And the budget also made reference to £20,000 of income from self-employment at some point in probably by the end of this Parliament as well. They also signalled the introduction of Making Tax Digital for corporation tax, with further consultation on that expected next year. So it's just doesn't get a lot of press, but it will be a big shift for a lot of small businesses and how they interact with their financial reporting and their interactions with their accountants. So it's worth just getting on everybody's radar that that's coming down the road and was sort of buried in the budget.
Okay, I'm going to pick up one point you made there, and I'm going to get on to a question that we've had come in there, or a clarification that's needed. So a couple of clarifications. Just, you mentioned what can be a very emotive subject there, council tax, and it's just obviously to make the point that about 1/5 of what council's income comes from is the council tax, and the other 4/5 is actually coming from Scottish Government. So yeah, there's changes potentially in how that's handled, but it's still a relatively small proportion of a council's revenue in order to do the things it needs to do. Point of clarification from one of our audience. Did they hear right? Are business rates relief for retailers being scrapped in Scotland? Did we say that? No, shaky heads. No, so we didn't say that. You didn't hear right, unfortunately, on that one, or fortunately on that one. So that was just a wee question, a wee point of clarification that someone was asking, and we've got questions coming in thick and fast here. Sorry, Susan.
I think they've picked up Stacey. I think Stacey was saying that there's rates relief for retail being announced in England, but we didn't get.
Yes.
We got hospitality in Scotland, but not retail. So we were hoping for more relief, but it didn't happen for retail in Scotland. I think that's.
There's an additional relief for hospitality coming to Scotland, but unfortunately not the same for retailers.
Yeah. Sorry, Greg.
I was going to say, just in terms of the things hidden in the budget, I get the point on making tax digital for corporation tax. Susan, that's going to be pretty difficult from the compliance point of view. But interest on tax payments, there's a wee sneaky stealth tax, one would argue, hidden in there, where they've put basically 1.5% over and above the percentage that you're going to get charged in late payments of corporation tax. Now, historically, people would potentially, companies would pay tax late, and the cost, maybe the interest rate was 3% on late payment, and it wasn't particularly prohibitive, wasn't particularly punitive. And the whole point, I suppose, about interest is it's supposed to be restorative and not punitive. Now it's potentially punitive, and if it's 8.75% on late payment of, for example, corporation tax, it's you know, people are going to notice that. A lot of the conversations we have with clients are around, well, we're struggling to pay at the moment. We'll just, you know, for example, wait for a few months to pay the corporation tax bill. You know, for example, you could have a situation where the corporation tax is due 9 months after the year end, but the tax return doesn't have to be filed until 12 months after the year end, so they might be struggling a wee bit after 9 months. So consequently, they'll just hold fire and not pay the corporation tax in time. And then, you know, 8.75% on unpaid tax is an amount that people will notice. So I realise it's easy for me to say, but certainly you should be having a conversation in terms of when tax is due and avoiding late payment, because there's a wee kind of hidden, arguably stealth tax in there, which is making it more punitive.
Oh, brilliant, good point, good catch on that, Greg. We're talking there about retail, and we've had a really interesting question on. I think I saw this in the budget, the Scottish budget, funding allocated to regenerate town centres, and the question is this specific towns and what's the value? I think I saw a figure of 20 million for town centre regeneration, which is obviously very important for retail businesses. Specific town centres include, were there? Okay, Stacey, you're nodding.
It was, I think they'd already been identified prior to the budget, so the budget contains a list of the specific town centres. The only one I can remember off the top of my head at the moment is a centre in Postle Park, I believe. I don't want, Hamilton is ringing a bell, but I may have just announced that Hamilton's getting funding that is not, but I know that Postle Park was definitely, but there is a list of specific town centre regeneration projects that money will be allocated to. It's not an open fund.
There is more detail on the Scottish budget on the government's website, which is worth kind of pursuing and having a look at, and kind of trying to get under the skin of some of the numbers, which is sometimes a little bit of a challenge, but there is more information there. Another wee question that's come in: as an employer of a limited company, do I have to pay national insurance on a 0 hours contract employee? Ooh, here's an interesting question.
I think
and that's got the panel stumped, I think.
I think you would have to.
Yeah.
So
we'll take that one offline and we'll come back to you. Well done, you've stumped the panel. That's a first. We'll come back on that one to get an answer.
It will depend, doesn't it? It'll depend on. So I think that might be one that we could take offline here. Yeah,
we'll take that one offline and we'll come back to you on that one. Okay, moving on. Where are we? So we've talked here about kind of taxation. You've just mentioned there, Greg, a kind of hidden potential regulatory cost that's been introduced. So, Greg, how should SMEs plan for these potential changes? You know, you'd mentioned there about not putting your tax returns in late. So, okay, how do you organise to make sure you're properly aligned and fully compliant?
I mean, it's a difficult one. It's just to be as organised as possible and keep a keen eye on cash management. Make sure you know when things are falling due, and planning accordingly. It's very. I mean, I realise, for example, for some hospitality sectors, this is now the time they make all the money. So basically, the message has to be just plan it if you can in terms of cash management, and don't leave everything to the last minute in terms of managing for outflows. It's keep on going back to the point, but then I mean, I suppose Stacey and Susan have covered. I mean, the national minimum wage and employer NI increases, I think, is the single biggest challenge to SMEs going forward, because we'll get through probably the next few months, and then maybe in the early part of next year, a lot of people will have to be thinking about a number of employees, etc.
And it's, sorry, on you go.
No, I was going to say, I'm just going to dive in to back up what Greg had said here. I was going to mention this later, but I might just take the opportunity to plug the services of your accountant now, if you'll allow me. Can you allow me?
Okay.
Well, let me just back up a little bit what Greg said about what small businesses should really be thinking about post the budget. I think it's about really sitting down and looking at some of the costs that we know are coming down the line and how you're going to manage them and what that means in terms of your cash flow. So how do you need to change your prices, for example, or what you charge for your services to adapt to those costs. Greg's mentioned already how complex our tax system is. So the importance of being ready and sitting down with your accountant so you don't fall into the stress of inadvertently falling foul of that. So, for example, people might have lots of associations with more than one business, which can trip you up in terms of some of the tax rules. You don't want to end up in a situation where, as Greg said, you're a couple of years down the line, you've got tax investigation or you don't have enough money to pay your employees. It's just about being ready to avoid all of that stress. But simultaneously, if there's uncertainty in the economy right now, and maybe some businesses are sitting, waiting, that can create opportunity in the marketplace for some small businesses that can spot those opportunities. And the key thing is to make sure you've got the cash to realise those opportunities. So realising them is where some advice can really help. We, ACCA, did some advice with Intuit using QuickBooks recently, and there is a noticeable impact of small businesses who use an accountant to help your business grow. So not just for self-assessment, but to help advise you on an ongoing basis. So small businesses that use an accountant see 11.5% revenue growth year on year compared to those who don't. So accountants not just for Christmas or self-assessment, but can really help you plan how you address these changes and maximise the opportunities. Sorry, I had to get my plug in here.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Susan. Really helpful. Obviously, we've kind of touched in terms of sectors that might be getting a little better treatment out of the budget in terms of hospitality than perhaps others. And I suppose in a more kind of general thinking, I know, Stacey, that FSB produce a confidence index. How is that looking? What's that kind of showing at the moment? How are people feeling? How are businesses feeling?
Not very confident, unfortunately. We had the results from Q3 back fairly recently, and they're pretty bleak, unfortunately. At the start of the year, Q1, it was looking a bit more optimistic. I think after the period last year, it seemed that people were a bit more optimistic, but unfortunately, that has really gone off a cliff over the year. We're putting out the next survey for Q4, so if you see that, if you're a small business and you see that out, it will be shared on social media, etc. Please do fill it in, because we're very keen to see, obviously coming post both budgets, if sentiment has changed any. We're quite keen to see what the end of the year looks like, but yeah, no, unfortunately, I think we look at it across the UK, we look at it across different nations and regions, and unfortunately the last set of results showed that Scotland was the most pessimistic across the UK. So yes, as I said, we're very keen to see if the budgets have changed anything for Q4.
Okay, and the reason I asked that, and obviously you share that with us, we see the confidence index, which is really helpful to understand the picture and see what's going on. The government recently produced its kind of its economic bulletin, and in there, what I was reading was that there was quite considerable signs of confidence in the business community, and I was having a bit of a problem reconciling the two different views. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I guess that's the thing with stats, isn't it? You can make them say whatever you want them to, can't you, depending the way you cut it. But yeah, I don't know, maybe we just have more pessimistic people filling out our surveys. But yeah, you'd obviously have to look at, sample size, who that's gone out to, what questions have been asked. Yeah, as I said, there's very many ways of different cutting it. And I think obviously when you look at something like the IOD, I think they do a similar survey to us. I think the results were very similar in terms of not being very confident. The Fraser Vallanders are also looking at, particularly post New Deal for Business, how that's shifting in their reporting. There's not been a shift, so yeah, maybe we should all get together and commit to doing one single survey that we can.
Up. There's a thought. There's a thought. Goodness me, joining up. Oh. No, and I think all that does is to illustrate that very old adage: lies, damn lies, and statistics. So, okay, let's move on. Encourage anyone out there to ask us other questions. So moving on, how does the budget align with Scotland's goals for sustainability and the transition to net zero? There was certainly a number of kind of things appearing in the budget that were talking about, green jobs and so on. So what's our thoughts on that one? Susan, I'm going to come to you first on that one.
Okay. I would say overall there was relatively little in both budgets about climate change and climate ambitions, to be absolutely honest. One sector that probably you might say there was more detail on than most others was around the industries that support the move to clean energy, what the new UK government refers to as its clean energy mission, so largely renewable energies. So there was, I think, positive news from both the UK government budget and the Scottish budget about trying to put a bit more meat on the bones in terms of developing that renewable energy supply chain, further investment. So, for example, in Scotland, there was specific money put into the offshore wind supply chain. There was further announcements about embedding the centre of expertise in Aberdeen. So you did see a bit more joining of the dots, which I think everybody would welcome, between both governments trying to get that investment going for that particular sector. However, apart from that, and I think part of that is driven by the fact that energy supply security has really risen up the agenda over the last couple of years, and that's not going to stop given some of the turbulence that's going on around the world right now.
Yeah.
So that will help to some extent around giving hopefully greater certainty around energy costs across the UK, which we know has been a really, really severe driver of business costs. However, neither budget really, as I said, has got much in terms of the detail about what individual small businesses will need to do as part of our efforts to get to a net zero economy. There's still not a huge amount of detail from either government on that. So there's lots of general advice out there, as you'll be aware. Business Gateway plays its role in terms of advising businesses on steps you can take to be more sustainable. But I would say we're still lacking the certainty around what governments are going to do. So some of the difficult decisions that governments are going to make, which will have implications for businesses. For example, at some point, the tax system will start to reflect sustainability more. There's people have talked a lot about changes to road tax, for example, or tax on buildings to help us reuse buildings rather than building new. Those tax changes will have to come at some point if we're going to meet the net zero ambitions of both governments, but there's still very little detail. We need that clearer roadmap for small businesses to know what is safe and secure to invest your scarce resources in. So overall, good for the renewable energy sector, very limited further information, I would say, for other businesses about net zero.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Stacey, I could see you nodding along there. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think Susan hit the nail on the head there in saying that kind of level of detail. For our members, I think net zero, it still seems quite scary to the majority of our members in terms of they just kind of view it. Obviously we have members who are very, that is their business. They're very well advanced in the technical side of being involved in net zero. But I think for the general small business, particularly with the challenges that they're facing at the moment, it's kind of a bit, until there's that clear information of what that's going to mean for us. And not just because I think the focus is very much just now, because there's not a lack of detail, it's people are saying, oh, this is going to cost me this, it's going to, it's going to be a negative impact, when actually there could be a lot of opportunities for small business there. So I think it's kind of incumbent on the Scottish Government to kind of reframe that and saying, yes, it will mean changes to your business, but here are the opportunities that will balance out the impact that it's going to have on you. So yeah, we're certainly pushing the government to reframe things a bit more for small businesses.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. We kind of you mentioned, Susan, earlier there that kind of proposed changes to the way tax is going to be managed in terms of digitising and doing all these kind of things. So digital transformation, though, is something that governments are kind of wanting to see happen. They're wanting to see businesses be more digitally savvy. And just in terms of things, what else do we want? We want productivity, we want innovation, we want workforce development in SMEs. Are there measures in this budget that you think are fostering those kind of things, like innovation, like digital transformation? Are there measures in there that are going to help that, going to promote it? Do you feel there's something there? Susan?
So on one level, the best thing to enable investment, whether it's in workforce development or broader innovation, tends to be a bit more stability and certainty, right? So I suppose at a sort of high level, both governments were trying to sort of signal a bit of stability. The actual detail on more specific schemes was pretty limited, I would say, for both budgets. However, as I mentioned, we're in a phase of, especially for the new UK government, there's a lot of new policies still to come. So I mentioned the small business strategy that will come. Stacey probably be closer to that than me, so we don't know what will be in that yet. That might include some specific measures to encourage innovation in small businesses. On skills, again, a big change might not affect a lot of small businesses, but for those who pay the apprenticeship levy, there's changes expected at UK level on the apprenticeship levy. Now, the reason that matters is because the money from that gets passed to the Scottish Government, and then they choose how to deploy that money within Scotland. So some of that cash is what paid for the workforce flexible workforce development fund in Scotland, which was the main sort of upskilling training fund that SMEs could use in Scotland, which has been paused. So no more detail about those at the moment, but I would expect there will be change coming around skills funding in particular. On innovation, no major change to sort of R&D relief at the moment. There has been, people will be aware, there's been a big crackdown over the last year or so because of exploitation that's happened in that market, fraud that's gone on. So that's starting to resolve itself. But the budget document did, I think, indicate that they will keep the R&D system under review, so there might be more change. But I think limited details on specifics for small businesses, but the sort of signals about trying to get some stability to encourage investment, as I mentioned, that corporate tax roadmap to try and give some certainty.
Yeah.
Moving in the right direction, but limited details, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, I guess whilst there's limited detail, there must be some intent to try and deliver on the strategies that have recently been done. We've got the Green Industrial Strategy was recently published. We've got an innovation strategy, both from the Scottish Government. You touched on the UK Government with their small business strategy that they're wanting to bring it. I mean, I think as John Swinney said not long after he became First Minister, we've got too many strategies, let's just go on and do things, which is encouraging. That's nice, let's do that. We need some idea what we're doing, what direction we're trying to take things in, of course. Okay, Stacey, or Greg, any further thoughts on that one in terms of the kind of measures that might promote or support kind of key things that we want to see happening within the economy from businesses?
I just wanted to get, just in terms of the R&D point, I mean, Susan's absolutely right. R&D will continue. It's not going to be something that will disappear in the foreseeable future, certainly the lifetime of this Parliament. All that's happened really over the last few years is there's been a crackdown on the kind of more aggressive, I suppose, dare I say it, the ambulance chaser type R&D claims that are out there. But that was to be expected. You know, that's just a natural progression. But no, there's certainly enough initiatives. If you're pursuing, for example, R&D, the credits can be there still.
Okay. That's
Yeah, I
helpful,
think
Stacey.
you've hit the nail on the head again there, Hugh, with the strategies. I think these strategies, they tend to paint a lovely picture that I think we can all get on board with, but unfortunately they can be lacking on the implementation plan, and particularly the funding to actually deliver some of the how we actually get to live in this utopia that some of the strategies like to paint out. I think a concrete, Susan mentioned the Flexible Workforce Development Fund. There was a big push last year amongst the business community, further education, for that not to be cut, and unfortunately it was cut last year. So I think it would have been a strong signal of concrete action to bring that back this year, but unfortunately we've not seen it.
Okay. Regional disparities, obviously, Scotland in particular, we have a very kind of urbanised central belt, but we have quite a number of more rural areas. Is there any kind of sense of regional disparities and how these budgets impact on Scotland in terms of rural versus urban? Any kind of sense or feeling or thoughts on that?
To some extent, I mean, that partly depends on certain geographies where there might be certain types of business are more prevalent, for example. So
yeah.
Greg mentioned earlier the amount of queries that accountants will be seeing from agricultural businesses in relation to inheritance tax, for example. Similarly, so there's some measures that will affect maybe tourism businesses, which you'll see maybe either in city centres or in more rural areas. So for example, Stacey mentioned the rates relief for hospitality businesses. That is different for island hospitality businesses, where the relief is more generous. There's a commitment from the Scottish Government to introduce a consultation on a cruise ship levy, which would have an impact on businesses that rely on those destinations where cruise ships visit. Potentially, people might be for or against that in terms of the impact that such a levy might have. Similarly, as I mentioned, there's the additional dwelling supplement element of the land and buildings transaction tax, which is more property focused, maybe in a city centre. That's got an impact on you. Similarly, if you're in the energy in North East. But one area where, and again, this is an indirect impact on small businesses, it's fair to say, but one area where the fund budgets make a real difference to support for small businesses can be through regional funding. So we spoke about some of the town centre regeneration funding, but the replacements for what used to be the European funding, so and latterly has been called Levelling Up funding or Shared Prosperity Fund, these funds, which tend to be delivered by local authorities or enterprise agencies, they deliver a lot of funds and support systems that local businesses use. So it might be things like tourism infrastructure, it might be training or startup grants or growth grants for local businesses. There's been still no real clarity from the UK government on what the replacement funds will be. They sort of said they'll change it, but we don't know. So that landscape in Scotland is still quite uncertain. So if we're talking about that stability, some of these local agencies that want to put in certainty of support for the local business community are stymied a little bit until we get more detail, I think, from governments about what that funding is going to look like. So I realise it's indirect, but ultimately it delivers the sort of direct support that a lot of small businesses will rely on. Yeah,
no, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to cycle back because there's a question in the chat from one of our delegates, and we're coming back round to the NI question just briefly. Is it now the case that many SMEs will lose the employment allowance because the employer's national insurance will pass the threshold for the allowance? Now, that might be a wee bit too technical, and we might want to take that one offline and come back on that one. We take it offline, come back on that one.
Unless Greg wants to.
No, I'd have to check that one. Sorry.
Right. Okay, no problem.
Yes, it increases your employment costs and minimises the benefit of the employment allowance the more your wage bill is essentially. So it'll very much depend on what your configuration of your wage bill looks like, I suppose. And as Stacey said, the smaller number of employees you've got, the less the impact is. The more you've got, then the bigger the changes you're going to see, and the more you might want to think about the configuration of your roles and how you manage those costs.
Okay, we'll probably come back on that one because it depends. It's the kind of key answer there. Okay, just very conscious of time. We've got about 5 minutes left. So what I'm going to kind of touch on now, because I'm particularly keen to get kind of thoughts from yourselves on this. What additional support or policy changes would you like to see in future budgets to better support SMEs? Stacey, I'm going to come to you first. So thinking about the future and what might change, how we might influence, what would you want to see in future budgets that would help SMEs?
Yeah, I think a big ask across kind of business and kind of third sector, probably public sector as well, is, we tend to, live year to year with these budget cycles. There's, things like multi-year funding, thinking about particular something that was introduced this year, the Entrepreneurial Education Fund, I think, the Deputy First Minister announced. So that's closed now, and we know that organisations will be given funding for 1 year. So, obviously, the organisations delivering those initiatives will get into that horrible cycle of, is this going to be sustainable? The work that they're doing, those kinds of initiatives, you don't wrap that up in a year. So it would obviously help them a great deal, I would imagine, if they had that stability, knowing that they can develop their programmes over a multi-year funding. It's not just things like funding as well. I think about, every year it comes to the small business bonus scheme, we have to push for, please don't change the thresholds, please don't reduce the support available. So a bit more confidence, perhaps, that the government is committing to leaving that support as it is for more than 1 year would certainly be very welcome, so that we're not kind of caught in this kind of short-termism cycle that we tend to be at the moment, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you for that, Stacey. Greg, any thoughts about what you would want to see in future budgets to help SMEs?
I don't think the increase in diversity between, but the divergence between England and Scotland in terms of income tax rates, for example, it helps SMEs. It does make it much more complicated north of the border in terms of managing payrolls and things like that. There is within the devolved powers of possibility that, for example, corporation tax could change in terms of the main UK rate, which I don't think would help either in terms of making things easier for SMEs going forward. It goes back to the point. It's what SMEs I think are looking for is certainty going forward, and you're never going to get that in a volatile political environment. I mean, certainly you'd expect in terms of the United Kingdom, the Labour Party will probably be there for 5 years anyway, so there might be some certainty, but there's obviously an election coming in Scotland. If Labour, for example, were to win in Scotland at the next Scottish election, it'd be very interesting as to what happens with the income tax rates, for example, because I don't know, I think you might have to see a convergence rather than a divergence if that was to happen, but who knows, it's all up in the air, and it makes it very difficult for people to plan.
That old Chinese curse, we live in interesting times, which seems to be just permanent at the moment in terms of interesting times, unfortunately. No, really good points, Greg. Thanks for that. Susan?
Yeah, I think as the others have said, what we desperately need is some confidence back in the economy for business. So earlier this year, a lot of the business surveys, as people thought that maybe change was coming, as indeed it did, we saw sort of confidence rose, but unfortunately it looks like the government sort of overcooked the negativity and confidence has plunged across surveys since then, and neither budgets have done much to resurrect that. The best way to do that, as others have said, as I said earlier, without it being a pipe dream, because politics, as much stability and simplicity in the tax and incentives for investment and growth as governments can afford to give us, that's what we need to help restore confidence.
Superb. Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. As I say, we're running out of time. Can I thank all our delegates for joining us this afternoon? I hope you found that useful. As I say, we haven't got to any of the questions you've asked, we will certainly follow those up. A huge thank you from me to our three fantastic panelists for giving up their time and giving us their expertise and knowledge on this. Some superb insights there on the budgets and what's been happening. So it just remains for me to say, please join us on our future panel webinars as we address these kind of important topics for small and medium-sized enterprises in Scotland. In the meantime, look after yourselves, look after your loved ones, have a great Christmas when it comes, and no doubt we will see you all again. Take care, folks. Cheers for now.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.